My name is Jessica, and looking back, it's never the one big explosion that shatters you, it's the 1,000 tiny cracks that weaken the foundation first. For 26 years, I had been living in a house with a fractured foundation, convincing myself the tremors were just the wind. That night, at my father's birthday party, I finally understood that the house wasn't just fractured. It was designed to collapse on top of me. The party was exactly as you'd imagine. Our home, a sprawling colonial testament to my father's success in commercial development, was suffocatingly warm. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, catered hors d'oeuvres, and John Sinclair's particular brand of self-satisfaction. I watched him from the edge of the living room, a ghost at my own family's feast. He was holding court, his laugh a booming punctuation mark in every conversation. He hadn't greeted me when I arrived an hour earlier. I had walked right up to him, said, "Happy birthday, Dad," and he had simply nodded, his eyes already scanning over my shoulder for a more important guest. I realize now that this was his signature move, erasure by proximity. He didn't need to yell to tell me I was worthless. He just had to look through me. I clutched a glass of sparkling water, the condensation cold against my fingers, and let the familiar slow burn of memory start. I was 10, holding up a report card with straight A's and 1 B+. He'd held it between his thumb and forefinger like it was contaminated. A B+ in mathematics, Jessica? The Sinclairs are not B+ people. Your brother understands that. James, my older brother, had gotten a C in history that same semester, but Dad had clapped him on the back and praised his strategic thinking on the football field. I learned then that my currency was academic perfection, and even then the exchange rate was abysmal. When I graduated from college, summa cum laude, he'd dismissed my real estate license as a cute hobby. It's not a real profession, Jessica. It's what women do when they have nothing better to do. It's not tangible. This from a man who built his empire on property. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Yet I swallowed it, just like I swallowed everything else. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself he was from a different generation. I built an entire career out of being told my career wasn't real, brick by painful brick. This year, I thought, would be different. This year, I had brought a tangible offering. Parked in the driveway, gleaming under the porch lights, was a brand new BMW 7 Series. Black on black. It had cost me nearly half my annual commission, a sum that had made my hands shake when I signed the papers. But the image I'd held in my mind of my father's face finally breaking into a smile of genuine pride, of him finally seeing me as successful, as worthy, had made it seem like a sound investment. I had presented him with the keys when I arrived, and he had simply pocketed them. "We'll see," was all he'd said. My mother found me by the French doors leading to the patio. "You look lovely, darling," she murmured, her hand fluttering near my arm but not quite touching it. Her specialty was the near miss of affection. "Your father loves the car. He's been telling everyone about his new car." His new car. The words landed like tiny stones in my stomach. "I'm glad he likes it," I said, the lie tasting like ash. The main event, the moment that would become the epicenter of the earthquake, came an hour later. My father, champagne flute in hand, tapped a spoon against its rim. The chatter died instantly. He had that kind of gravity. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice radiating the benevolent authority he so carefully cultivated. He spoke of legacy, of hard work, of building something that lasts. He praised my brother James's latest business venture. He praised my younger sister Sarah's engagement to a man he deemed suitable. My own internal monologue was a frantic prayer. Please just mention my name. Just once. He then gestured vaguely towards the front of the house where the BMW sat. "A man works hard his whole life," he boomed, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. "And eventually, you get the things you deserve." The silence that followed was more damning than any insult. The space where my name should have been was a physical void, a vacuum that sucked the air from my lungs. I saw a few guests, friends of mine who knew I'd bought the car, shift uncomfortably. They looked at me with pity, and the pity burned worse than the omission. But he wasn't finished. His eyes, cold and calculating, found mine across the room. He raised his glass a little higher, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "It's about creating a legacy of success," he said, his gaze locked on me. "Not one of failure." Failure. The word didn't echo. It landed. A single, perfectly aimed bullet. The chattering of the party, the clinking of glasses, the soft music, it all faded into a dull roar. The only thing I could feel was a sudden, chilling stillness in my own veins. My pulse wasn't racing. It was something worse. It was gone. I turned and walked away. No one tried to stop me. I moved through the crowd like a phantom, my path clearing before me as if they were afraid to touch the source of such a public execution. I found my mother in the kitchen overseeing the caterers with a frantic, forced smile. "Mom," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. She turned, her smile faltering when she saw my face. "Jessica, what is it? Did you hear that? Did you hear what he just said to me in front of 50 people?" Her eyes darted away, landing on a tray of canapes as if it were a life raft. She started rearranging a curl of smoked salmon. "Don't make a scene, Jessica," she whispered, her voice tight. "You know how your father is. It's his birthday." And that was it. That was the final crack. It wasn't just his cruelty. It was her complicity. Her lifelong, desperate campaign for peace at the cost of her own daughter's soul. In that quiet, sterile kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a celebration I was no longer part of, I understood that I was utterly and completely alone. The person who was supposed to be my defender was handing my executioner the sharpening stone. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, through the grand foyer, and out the front door into the cool night air. The BMW sat there, a monument to my own foolish, desperate hope. I walked past it, to my own modest car parked down the street. I slid into the driver's seat. The emotional dam had broken, but it didn't result in tears. There was no screaming, no frantic, ragged breaths. There was only a profound, terrifying calm, a clarity so sharp it hurt. I stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, at the face of a 26-year-old woman who had spent her entire life begging for scraps of love from a table she was never invited to sit at. My hand went to my purse, my fingers brushing against the crisp corner of a sealed, heavyweight envelope. The receipt. The one piece of undeniable truth I had brought with me tonight. A secret shield I had hoped I would never have to use. The results from the lab had been sitting in my desk for a month, a quiet bomb I was too afraid to detonate. He called me a failure. He had built a legacy on my submission, on my quiet acceptance of my own erasure. And my mother, my own mother, had told me not to make a scene. I looked back at the house, at the warm yellow light spilling from the windows, a picture of perfect family happiness. It was all a lie, and they had left me with no choice but to burn it to the ground. A slow smile touched my lips, but I'm sure it looked more like a snarl. I started the car. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound in the world, and in that moment, I made a silent vow. My war would not be fought with tears or shouts. It would be fought with cold, hard facts. It would be a quiet, methodical demolition. And as I pulled away from the curb, a single, clear thought echoed in the newfound stillness of my mind. Let him think I'm broken. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of streetlights and silence. The chilling stillness I'd felt in my car hadn't thawed. If anything, it had hardened, crystallizing into something solid and heavy in my chest. I remember parking in my designated spot, the quiet click of the engine shutting off sounding like a gunshot in the sterile quiet of the underground garage. I didn't rush. For the first time in my life, I felt no urgency to please, to explain, to fix. The performance was over. My apartment, a clean, minimalist space in the heart of the city, felt like a sanctuary. It was a world I had built for myself, funded by the career he called a hobby. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, was a quiet testament to my own competence, a reality I had never truly let myself inhabit until that moment. The air inside didn't smell like forced celebration. It smelled like me. I dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. A sharp, definitive clatter. Then I walked to my desk, took the sealed heavyweight envelope from my purse, and placed it in the center of the polished wood surface. I didn't need to open it. I had read the words inside once, a month ago, and they had been seared into my memory. Probability of paternity, 0%. A perfect score. An absolute absence. The undeniable scientific fact that had briefly felt like a tragedy, but which I now understood was a map. This was the beginning of my receipts montage, the moment I began to transform 26 years of pain into a cohesive, prosecutable case. My receipts weren't crumpled slips of paper. They were memories, and with the DNA test as my new lens, I began to see them in high definition. I pulled out the old family photo albums, the ones my mother so dutifully curated. There we were, the Sinclair family, frozen in glossy 4x6 perfection. I saw it so clearly now. In every group shot, I was slightly on the periphery. In a photo from my 10th birthday, my father's arm was around James, his hand resting on Sarah's head. I stood next to him, but he wasn't touching me. My smile was a desperate, hopeful thing. His was a tight, obligatory line. I found the big family portrait we'd had professionally taken 5 years ago. James with his square Sinclair jaw. Sarah with my father's sharp blue eyes. My mother, a beautiful, nervous bird. And me. I had always thought I just had my mother's softer features, but now I saw the truth. It wasn't about features. It was about the entire composition. I was a different font, a different color palette. I simply didn't match. My mind started playing back his words, the auditory receipts of my emotional audit. You're too emotional, Jessica. Sinclairs are logical. We don't let feelings cloud our judgment. That artistic streak of yours, you must get that from your mother's side. Look at James. He just gets it. It's in his blood. It's in his blood. He had been telling me the truth my entire life, disguised as insults. Every criticism, every backhanded compliment, every comparison. It wasn't about shaping me. It was about highlighting my otherness. He wasn't a disappointed father. He was a zookeeper, constantly pointing out that one of the animals didn't belong in the enclosure. As I sat there, the house of cards that was my childhood collapsing in silence, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my sister, Sarah. I almost ignored it, but morbid curiosity won. Her text read, "Are you okay? Dad is going on and on about the car. He just took Uncle Robert for a spin and told him it was an unexpected bonus from the Westfield deal. He's acting like he bought it himself." I stared at the screen, and a laugh escaped my lips. It was a dry, humorless sound. Of course he did. John Sinclair, the narrative thief. He didn't just dismiss my offering, he consumed it. He absorbed it into his own story, erasing my role completely. It was the ultimate act of his peculiar brand of tyranny, to take the very symbol of my desperate bid for his love and use it as a prop to inflate his own ego. The text was a gift. It was another receipt, a time-stamped piece of evidence of his brazen, pathological need to control the story. It hardened my resolve into something akin to steel. This was the moment the shift happened inside me. The deep, aching question of my childhood, "Why doesn't he love me?" finally dissolved. It was the wrong question. It implied the possibility of an answer I could provide, a change I could make. The new question was colder, clearer, and infinitely more powerful. He couldn't love me. So why did I let him convince me I was the one who was broken? I felt a wave of grief, but not for the father I never had. I grieved for the girl in those photographs. I mourned the 26 years she had spent auditioning for a role she was never cast in. I mourned her relentless, exhausting hope. She had contorted herself into knots, dimming her own light so as not to offend his, all for the approval of a man who looked at her and saw a biological error. The anger I felt was no longer hot and directionless. It was a cold, focused energy. It was fuel. He hadn't just denied me a father's love. He had actively stolen my sense of self piece by piece, and I had handed him the tools to do it. The plan began to form then, not as a conscious strategy, but as an inevitable conclusion. A quiet email wouldn't work. A private confrontation would be dismissed, my words twisted. The humiliation had been public. The correction had to be public. The narrative had been stolen in front of an audience. It had to be reclaimed in front of one. And the perfect stage was the one he had just built. His own birthday party. The scene of the crime. I stood up from my desk. I put the photo albums away, closing the cover on that chapter of willful blindness. I picked up the sealed envelope. The smoking gun. It felt different in my hand now. It was no longer a source of shame or a symbol of my otherness. It was a key. It was a weapon. It was the truth. I walked back to my car, the keys to the BMW, my spare set, feeling heavy and significant in my pocket. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully performed his final act of erasure, absorbed my grand gesture, and put me, the failure, in my place. He thought I had retreated. Broken. But I wasn't broken. I was being forged. And as I slid back into the driver's seat and headed back towards his house, I knew my purpose with absolute clarity. The hurt was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was no longer in charge. Resolve was. My final thought before pulling back onto his street was a declaration. It was the thesis statement for the rest of my life. It was never about the BMW. It was about the narrative, and I'm here to correct the record. Driving the reclaimed BMW back to my father's house felt like a declaration of war in itself. This car was no longer a desperate peace offering. It was my chariot. Each purr of the engine was a reminder that I had funded this symbol of status he so easily claimed as his own. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't park down the street. I parked directly behind the car of a guest who had blocked the main entrance, an unapologetic assertion of my presence. I was no longer willing to make myself smaller for anyone's convenience. Walking back through the front door was like stepping through a portal into another dimension. The party had migrated to the formal dining room, the air now thick with the smell of roasted beef and expensive red wine. The light was dimmer, more intimate, which only made the coming spectacle more potent. A few guests in the foyer saw me first, their conversations faltering. A ripple of awareness spread through the house. The ghost had returned. My father saw me from his seat at the head of the long mahogany table. His face, flushed with wine and self-importance, tightened with annoyance. My mother, seated at the opposite end, looked at me with pure, undiluted panic. Her eyes were wide, pleading with me in a silent, desperate language I no longer spoke. I gave her a small, unreadable nod and found an empty chair at the far end of the table, a seat clearly meant for a guest who hadn't shown. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and waited. My stillness was a live wire in the room. I could feel the energy shift, the easy laughter around the table becoming a little more strained. They could all sense it. The predator was back in the room, but they had mistaken which one it was. I didn't have to wait long. After the main course plates were cleared, my father, John Sinclair, pushed his chair back slightly and stood, holding his wine glass. This was his moment, the patriarch, surveying his kingdom. "If I could have everyone's attention," he began, though he already had it. "On a day like today, a man reflects on his legacy." I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, my hands perfectly steady. I watched him, not as a daughter, but as a strategist observing her target. Every word he spoke was a nail he was hammering into his own coffin. "Legacy isn't about money," he pontificated, a statement so laughably false that a few of his business associates exchanged knowing smirks. "It's about blood. It's about passing on your values, your strength, your integrity, to the next generation. It's about loyalty." He looked pointedly down the table, his gaze skipping over me as if I were a piece of furniture. "I am proud to say that my children understand this. They understand that the Sinclair name means something. It stands for quality, for resilience, for an unbroken chain of excellence. He went on, his voice dripping with false humility and alcohol-fueled sentimentality. He was building his own myth, right there in front of everyone. And as I listened, I felt no pain. The words no longer had the power to cut me. I was simply a prosecutor, listening to the defendant perjure himself, making my job that much easier. He raised his glass for the final flourish. So I thank you all for being here to celebrate not just my life, but the strong, loyal family that is my greatest achievement. The applause was polite, obligatory. As it died down, and before the chatter could resume, I placed my water glass down with a soft, definitive click. And then, I stood up. Every head turned. The silence that fell was absolute, heavy with expectation. My father's face was a mask of cold fury. He had not given me the floor. "Dad?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned room. It was calm, level, and utterly devoid of the emotion he expected. "Since we are on the topic of legacy and blood, I'd like to make a contribution." I didn't look at anyone else. My focus was entirely on him. "For 26 years," I continued, "I have operated under the assumption that I was, as you so publicly stated earlier tonight, a failure. I have tried to earn my place at this table, believing that my efforts were the problem." I let that hang in the air for a beat. I could see my brother James shifting in his seat, a smug look on his face, assuming this was some pathetic, emotional plea. He was wrong. "Let me correct the record on a few points," I said, my tone shifting to that of a CEO delivering a quarterly report. "First, the BMW parked in the driveway, the one you claimed was a bonus from the Westfield deal, was not a bonus. It was a birthday gift. From me. Purchased with the commission from a career you have consistently belittled." A collective, quiet gasp went around the table. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. John's face was turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Second," I went on, my pace unhurried, "you spoke of loyalty and integrity. For my entire life, you have held me to a standard you have never applied to my siblings, framing my achievements as insignificant while celebrating theirs. I've always wondered why." I paused, then took a slow step away from my chair and began to walk toward the head of the table. Every eye followed me. The journey down the length of that dining room felt like 100 miles. It was the longest walk of my life and the most powerful. I stopped when I was standing directly to his right. He refused to look at me, staring straight ahead, his jaw so tight I could see the muscle flexing in his cheek. "I finally understand why," I said, my voice dropping slightly, forcing everyone to lean in. I reached into my purse and pulled out the crisp white envelope. "I finally understand why you could never see me as a success, why I was never good enough." I placed the envelope on the polished mahogany table, directly in front of him. The soft thud it made was the loudest sound in the world. "The issue was never my worth," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It was my biology." The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was a dead, airless vacuum. I saw my mother's face crumple, a silent scream of a confession. James looked from the envelope to my face, his own expression one of dawning, horrified confusion. John Sinclair finally turned his head and looked at me. For the first time, I saw not anger, not contempt, but fear. Pure, primal fear. He had been exposed, not by accusations, but by a single, undeniable piece of paper. I held his gaze for one final moment. Then I looked at the stunned faces around the table, the family and friends who had been spectators to my quiet humiliation for years. I gave them nothing. I turned to my father one last time and concluded with a quiet power that was more devastating than any shout. "You can have your story, but you cannot build it on top of my name." And with that, I turned my back on him, on all of them, and walked out of the dining room. I didn't run. My steps were measured and even. I walked through the now silent house, out the front door, and into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had left the bomb on the table, and the silence I left in my wake was the sound of my entire world, and his, changing forever. Driving away from the house a second time was nothing like the first. The chilling stillness had been replaced by a profound, hollow emptiness. The adrenaline from the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind the quiet hum of the BMW's engine and the stark reality of what I had just done. I hadn't just exposed a lie, I had detonated a family. My phone, which I had placed face down on the passenger seat, began to vibrate. Then it lit up. A call from Dad. I watched the screen, my face illuminated in the dark car by his name. The call went to voicemail. Immediately, it lit up again. Mom, ignored. Then James. Then Sarah. Then a number I recognized as my Aunt Carol's. It was a digital fusillade, a frantic barrage of attempts to pull me back into the chaos I had just authored. For a moment, I saw it from their perspective. The shattered dinner party, the stunned guests, the incriminating envelope lying on the table like a death certificate. I imagined my father's face, a mask of apoplectic rage, and my mother's, a landscape of pure devastation. I felt a flicker of something, not regret, but the phantom pain of an amputated limb. That family, as toxic and broken as it was, had been the only one I had ever known. I picked up the phone, but instead of answering, I pressed the side button and held it until the screen went black. The silence that followed was a choice. It was the first true boundary I had ever set in my life. I drove back to my apartment, the city lights smearing across my windshield, and for the first time, I felt the profound loneliness of being truly, utterly free. The next few days passed in a haze. The silence was different now. It wasn't the tense, waiting silence of before, but the quiet, echoing silence of an aftermath. The digital storm had ceased. I knew they were communicating with each other, a frantic rewiring of the family switchboard now that the main line had been cut. I was the dark star they now orbited, and my absence was a gravitational force of its own. On the third day, a text came from my mother. Can we please talk? Just us. There's a coffee shop on Mercer Street. Noon tomorrow. Mercer Street. An anonymous place in a part of town we never frequented. A neutral territory for a peace treaty or a surrender. I agreed. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table in the corner. She looked diminished. The polished, perfectly coiffed Sinclair matriarch was gone. In her place was a woman who looked her age, her face etched with sleepless nights, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a paper cup. This was the first piece of fallout I could see up close. The truth had dismantled her. Thank you for coming, she said, her voice thin. I didn't reply, just sat and waited. I was not there to make this easy for her. His name was Thomas Gable, she began, staring into her coffee as if the story were written in the foam. He was my first love in college. We were going to get married. My parents, they didn't approve. He was a scholarship student, an aspiring architect with no family money. They pushed me towards your father. John was stable, ambitious, the right choice. She recounted the story in a low, pained monotone. The forced breakup, the discovery a month later that she was pregnant, the panic. And then John's proposal. It wasn't an act of pure love, I learned. It was a transaction. He would get the social standing that came with marrying her, and he would give my mother a solution to her problem on one condition. Thomas Gable would never be told, and the child would be raised as a Sinclair, no questions asked. He promised, Jessica, she whispered, finally looking at me, her eyes swimming with a grief that was 30 years old. He promised he would love you as his own. I think, in his own way, he tried. But every time he looked at you, he saw another man. He saw my past. You have Thomas's eyes. You have his stubborn refusal to just accept things. The more you grew into yourself, the more you looked like a ghost to him. and he came to resent you for it. I listened, impassive. I was a journalist gathering the facts of a 26-year-old cold case, my own. And you let him, I stated. It wasn't a question. You watched him punish me for existing, and you said nothing. I was a coward, she said. The words a raw, painful admission. I was so terrified of the whole thing blowing up, of losing the life I had built, that I told myself it wasn't that bad. I told myself you were strong, that you could handle it. I chose my comfort over your pain. And that is a failure I will take to my grave. I didn't offer her forgiveness. I didn't have any to give. But in her confession, I found a piece of my own closure. My suffering hadn't been a figment of my imagination. It was real. It had a name, a history, a reason. I stood up. Thank you for telling me, I said. The words were formal, distant. I left her there, alone with the ghost of Thomas Gable and the wreckage of the life she had chosen. The small alignments began that evening, a call from Sarah. Her voice was hesitant, fumbling. Jess, I'm so sorry, she said. I always saw it. The way he was with you, I didn't know what to do. I was scared. It's not an excuse, but it's the truth. What you did, it was terrifying. And it was brave. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real. An hour later, a text from my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister. Jessica, I'm so sorry for all of it. We all saw it. We all saw it. That one sentence was a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still open. It was the quiet, somber validation that I hadn't been crazy. My reality had been the real one all along. This external confirmation gave me the courage to take the final step. My mother had given me his name. Thomas Gable. I spent an evening online, an archaeological dig into the life of the man who had given me my eyes. He was a successful architect in Chicago, a partner at a prestigious firm. There were photos of him, of his wife, of their 2 children, my half-siblings. I wrote an email. It was the hardest thing I have ever written. It was short, factual, and devoid of emotion. I stated my name, my date of birth, my mother's name, and the reason I had for believing he was my biological father. I attached nothing. I asked for nothing. I simply stated that I felt he had a right to know. I hit send and felt like I had thrown a message in a bottle into the vast, unknowable ocean. 2 days later, his reply appeared in my inbox. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked it open, my heart hammering against my ribs. The email was cautious, but it was not dismissive. It was kind. Jessica, it began. I have read your email 6 times, and to say I am in a state of shock would be an understatement. I have no reason to doubt what you are telling me. There is a part of my life that has now been completely recontextualized. I will need some time to process this for my own sake and for my family's. But I want to be clear. I believe you. And if and when you are comfortable with it, I would very much like to talk. I read the email 3 times. My pulse wasn't racing. It was steady. A single tear, the first I had shed through this entire ordeal, traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or anger. It was a tear of relief. John Sinclair had spent my entire life telling me I didn't belong. But here was a stranger, a ghost from my mother's past, looking at the same facts and, without hesitation, making space for me. This was the ultimate validation. A door had opened, not to a perfect, ready-made family, but to a possibility. A future that was mine to define, completely independent of the Sinclair narrative. I held the phone to my chest, and for the first time since I walked out of that disastrous party, I felt the first true, quiet moment of peace. The war was over. The rebuilding could now begin. The 6 months that followed the reckoning were not a time of triumphant celebration, but of quiet, methodical construction. The demolition was complete. Now I had to build something new on the cleared ground. My life, which had once been a frantic and exhausting performance for an audience of 1, became my own quiet workshop. It started in my apartment. One Saturday, I woke up with an overwhelming urge to paint. I went to the hardware store and bought 3 gallons of a warm, calming shade of green. For 2 days, I painted my living room, the physical act of covering the sterile, landlord beige walls feeling like a tangible form of healing. I was literally changing the space around me, making it my own. I went through my closets and boxed up years of accumulated history, trinkets from childhood, gifts from my father that always felt more like obligations than offerings. I didn't throw them away in a fit of anger. I just stored them. I was archiving a life that was no longer mine, making space for the one that was. My work became my sanctuary. The confidence I had always feigned in front of clients became real. No longer shackled by the internal monologue of my father's disapproval, my professional instincts sharpened. I took risks. I negotiated harder. I closed the biggest deal of my career, a multi-unit commercial property that earned me a commission that was, ironically, more than enough to buy 3 of the BMWs that had started it all. The success felt different this time. It wasn't a desperate plea to be seen. It was simply the result of my own competence. It was mine. My true legacy, I discovered, wasn't going to be built in boardrooms. It started with an act of quiet generosity. My mother had left my father a month after the party. It was a messy, painful separation, but she had done it. She was living in a drab, temporary rental, a ghost of her former self. One afternoon, I called her. "I'm a real estate professional, Mom," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Let me help you find a place that's yours." And so, I did. I used my skills not for profit, but for her. We found a small, bright 2-bedroom apartment with a little balcony, a place that felt nothing like the oppressive colonial house she had spent 30 years tending to. I was there the day she got the keys. We stood together in the empty living room, the afternoon sun streaming through the clean windows. "Thank you, Jessica," she said, her voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from her before. Pure, unadulterated gratitude. Not just for this, for everything. You were braver for me than I ever was for you. In that moment, I saw not the enabler who had failed me, but a woman finally finding her own footing. I realized forgiveness wasn't a transaction. It was the quiet, gradual process of seeing someone clearly, flaws and all, and choosing to help them build something better. That same spirit of cautious discovery guided my connection with Thomas Gable. We started with emails, then phone calls. Our first meeting was at a quiet coffee shop in a city halfway between his and mine. Seeing him felt like looking into a strange, familiar mirror. He had my hands. He had a way of tilting his head when he was listening intently that I recognized from my own reflection. There was no grand, cinematic reunion. It was awkward and hesitant. 2 strangers trying to map the strange, invisible continent of their shared DNA. He was kind, intelligent, and carried a quiet sadness for the 26 years he never knew. He told me about his wife and his children, and I told him about my life, editing out the darkest parts of my history with Joan. This wasn't about replacing one father with another. It was about adding a new, unexpected chapter to my book. We agreed to keep talking, to let whatever relationship was meant to form slowly and honestly. For the first time, I had a paternal connection that wasn't predicated on a lie. It was a quiet, sturdy column being erected in the foundation of my new life. 3 months ago, I hosted a dinner party. It wasn't a party, really. It was just a dinner. The guest list was small and intentional. My mother, who was starting to laugh again. My sister Sarah, our conversations now filled with an easy honesty we'd never had before. And my best friend who had listened to me cry about my father for years. We sat around my small dining table, the one I'd bought with my own money. We drank cheap, delicious wine and ate pasta I'd made myself. The atmosphere wasn't triumphant. It was warm. It was authentic. It was peaceful. The easy cadence of conversation, the shared laughter, it was the exact opposite of the tense, performative misery of the Sinclair family dinners. This, I realized, was my new table. A table I had built myself, with seats reserved only for those who saw me and loved me for who I actually was. Last week, something shifted for the final time. I was reviewing a contract, and a thought of John Sinclair drifted into my mind, unbidden. I thought of him in that big, empty house, his anger his only companion, and I felt nothing. Not a single spark of anger, not a whisper of pain. Just a distant, clinical pity for a man so trapped in his own bitterness that he couldn't see the love that was offered to him. He no longer had any power over me. He didn't even occupy enough emotional real estate to be a villain anymore. He was just a sad story that I was no longer a character in. Which brings me to tonight. I'm standing on the rooftop terrace of a new high-rise downtown. The city sprawls out before me, a glittering tapestry of light and possibility. I just closed the deal on the penthouse unit behind me. My client is thrilled, my commission is staggering, and the quiet satisfaction I feel is deep and resonant. The air is cool, and the sounds of the city are a distant, comforting hum. I think back on the journey, the girl begging for a crumb of approval, the woman who learned to bake her own bread, build her own house, and set her own table. The world tells you that you are born into a family, a legacy, a seat that is assigned to you. For a long time, I believed that. I believed my seat was in the corner, in the dark, and I was grateful for it. But the most profound truth I've learned is that the most important spaces in our lives are not the ones we are given. They are the ones we claim. I look out at the endless horizon, at the future I am building with my own two hands, on my own terms. And I know, with a certainty that runs deeper than blood, deeper than biology, deeper than any name I was ever given or denied, the ultimate, unshakable truth. This seat was never given. I built it.